Hello and welcome to the primary art class CPD training video. Today we're going to be looking at assessment for primary art and design, and we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of it being useful as part of the artistic process. So this is not going to be looking at how we can map other assessment strategies or techniques onto art and design. We're going to be looking at how art and design as a subject inherently lends itself to lots of assessment in terms of self-assessment and peer assessment opportunities. So before we start, it's really useful for you to have a think about what the existing culture of art and design is currently in your school. So perhaps you want to jot this down on a piece of paper or just hold that thought in your head, but think about how assessment exists currently in your school. Do you mark sketchbooks? Do you use some sort of grid method? Do you use levels? Do you use verbal feedback? So any of the ways in which you are assessing either for your own information, for the information of your students, the art and design in your school. So you're probably familiar with the DFES information about art and design in primary school, and we think about in terms of attainment targets. By the end of each key stage, pupils are expected to know, apply and understand the matters, skills and processes specified in the relevant programme of study. Now, the relevant programme of study, if we think about what is presented to us in the national curriculum document, is a 2-page document, and it doesn't really include specifics. So it gives us a general idea of what should be covered and the approaches we might take, but it doesn't give us lists of genres or artists or specific skills. Of course, it mentions drawing, painting and sculpture and other craft and design techniques, but it doesn't give us specifics. So if you as an art lead are starting to design assessment, you're going to realise pretty soon that that assessment needs to be really linked to your curriculum, and your curriculum might be something that you've designed yourself. So that means that the relevant programme of study might be something quite bespoke for your school and your students, and therefore assessment probably needs to take that into consideration. This is just a excerpt from the NSEAD website. Schools have the freedom to develop a curriculum which is relevant to their pupils. This is what I was talking about in the last slide. Because of the lack of specifics in the national curriculum, schools and art leaders are left in a position of being able to really design and create and craft an art and design curriculum which is best suited to their school community. Now, of course, that can be a wonderful creative experience, especially if you're confident and have good knowledge in art and design. But if you are an art lead who isn't confident or perhaps doesn't feel they have the knowledge, that can be quite a daunting task. I have a CPD course available on my website, which is all about teaching about planning a primary art curriculum. So it might be worth having a look at that if you are feeling daunted by the task of designing a curriculum. Schools are required to use their own approaches to formative assessment to support pupil attainment and progression. Now, of course, we need to understand what we mean by pupil attainment. There aren't government standards provided for us for art and design, and progression is sometimes quite tricky to map out in an art and design curriculum. So before you think about assessment, you definitely need to look at your curriculum design. And like I mentioned before, there is support for that available for you on my website. The assessment framework should be built into the school curriculum so that schools can check what pupils have learned and whether they're on track to meet the expectations. Now, once again, important to remember that those expectations at the end of the key stage very much come from you and your curriculum design. Ofsted inspections are informed by whatever pupil tracking data schools choose to keep. It's really up to you to design the assessment procedures that are best fitting for your school community, and that really what we want is that they are really helping and supporting the students and informing your future planning. Now, I'm yet to come across a school, a primary school, where teachers are asked to report on levels or grades in art and design to parents. I've come across it sometimes in the private sector, but certainly not in the state sector. Um, Therefore, that again gives us the freedom to design assessment procedures that are genuinely useful to both the students and to us as art and design leaders. It's worth having a little look at the GCSE assessment objectives. Of course, we're not preparing primary students for GCSE art and design, but they really have some quite nice strands to them. So assessment objective 1 is about developing ideas. How do your students develop ideas? So this lends itself to a curriculum that isn't prescriptive. We want to leave space and room for students to develop their skills in developing their own ideas rather than spoon feeding them. Assessment objective 2 in GCSE art and design is refining work. So are your students able to, and are they given opportunities to look at their work, review it and refine it by trusting their own artistic competence and confidence? Do they explore different ideas? Do they select and experiment with different media, materials, techniques and processes? So this is again really thinking about students as independent artists in as much as possible. Assessment objective 3, record ideas, observations and insights. And 4, present a personal and meaningful response. Now you might be thinking this is too advanced for primary school students, but actually it's very possible to weave the assessment objectives that you see here into your art and design schemes of work. And therefore that can give us a little bit more of a framework for how we assess. I know that a lot of primary schools tend to focus assessment in art and design on the skills. So we assess drawing, painting, printing, 3D, collage maybe, and we look at the skills and techniques and the progression mapped out from year 1 to year 6, and we assess accordingly. However, I would say it's really useful and it's going to really build a culture of a rich art and design curriculum and ethos in your school if, as well as looking at the skills specifically, you look at these assessment points too. How do your students develop their ideas? How do they revisit and improve and refine their work? So of course you'll be familiar with the types of assessment usually discussed. We have summative assessment, which evaluates pupil knowledge and achievement, usually after a period of learning is complete. So what this might look like in the art and design classroom in primary is that the students have come to maybe week 5 or week 6, they've finished their final piece and you assess that final piece. So you might be looking at self-portraiture, you might be looking at how well those students have recorded the proportions of the face, you might be looking at line and tone and observational skills, and you're evaluating at the end of the project. So it's really important if you're doing summative assessments to think about whether or not it informs future planning. So if you've assessed that self-portrait, for example, and you've decided that the student hasn't got the proportions of the face quite right, are there going to be opportunities for that student to revisit? Does it inform your future planning? And also, who is this information shared with? Is it shared with your students? And if it is that really conducive to building the kind of explorative, um, self-led learning culture that we might want to be facilitating in our art and design lessons? Is it shared with parents? Is it shared with senior staff? At the end of a scheme of work or end of a project, you might be looking at summative assessment. Formative assessment, which is where art and design really lends itself to some formative assessment, is used to guide learning as the learning is happening. And it also gives a snapshot of progress. It's very much part of the art learning process. So there, keeping that in mind, we need to think about why we're doing it. Like we've said, it can inform learning as it's happening. We need to think about when does this happen? Now, you'll see as we go through the training today that the when can be very much integrated into every art lesson. You'll see that what I'm going to talk to you about today is how assessment can be part and parcel of the art and design lessons, not a separate thing that is done at the end or even at the end of individual lessons. And how do we do this? We're going to cover this today as well. So, like I mentioned earlier, if you're planning for progression and you're assessing progression in skills, you need to have some idea of what that progress looks like. And you need to have opportunities for students to revisit those skills and techniques. So it's no good saying that you're going to assess their use of charcoal if actually they only have one opportunity for charcoal in year 2 and they never use it again. So you need to really look, like I mentioned earlier, at your curriculum, at your plans, and think about the skills that you are assessing if you're going to be doing that, either in a formative or a summative way. So one of the ways that I know a lot of primary schools like to begin to build assessment and expectations is by collating portfolios of students' work according to your schemes. Now, obviously, you need to keep in mind that this will take some time to build. It will take years to build. And if you do get that deep dive visit from Ofsted, they are open to the idea that your assessment procedures might be a work in progress, as long as you are very comfortable and confident in which stage you are at in terms of collating these portfolios and why you're doing it. This should be a good enough response to what is your assessment, what your assessment looks like at the minute. So that would be quite simply, for each scheme of work, maybe collecting what you would think of as a really good example. We use language like beyond expected, expected, and working towards. That would be up to you. You could collect maybe just a cross section, a sample. You might want to focus in on the specific skills being looked at. So if you're collecting images to do with a scheme of work on still life, you might look at specifics around colour mixing, composition, etc. So collating a portfolio is a really nice way of starting to build your school's expectations for each scheme of work. So here we've got an example of a year six portfolio sample. And you can see that there is very clearly one which stands out as being technically very, very good. And then we've got 3 other examples here. And it's just a good thing to remember that when you're looking at working towards met or exceeded, for example, it depends on your criteria. Now, I would argue that this portrait may not have the technical flair that this one does, but it has got character. This is the only portrait which shows the background, and it really captures something of the pose and the personality of the student. So in terms of labeling children as met, exceeded, working towards, I'd be very wary of the criteria that you're using, and possibly wary of whether or not you're sharing these levels with the students and how useful it is to do that. Because what we don't want to do is dampen creative or artistic expression. That said, you will see as part of this training, you're able to download a document which is about skills progression. And there are things that we can be looking at in terms of technique. So we've got year 1 self-portrait here, year 3 looking at 3-point perspective and the grid method, year 5 looking at chiaroscuro and doing some still life drawings. So there are ways of mapping out progress in drawing. But then again, it could be argued that you could just as easily have decided to teach chiaroscuro in year 2. So it's really, a lot of it is down to where you decide to put things in your curriculum map. We've got reception, doing some colour mixing with coloured ice cubes, learning how to paint in the lines. Now, of course, that's not always what we're going to want a year 1 student to do. For example, if they're looking at Jackson Pollock or some expressionist art, we might not be so worried about them staying in the lines. So it's really important that you've decided what your criteria is. What we don't want is for the art and design lesson to become this kind of race to be the best at things. That happens in some other subject areas, and I think students are very aware whether they've been put into the top, middle, or bottom groups, whatever we call them, even if we call them triangle, square, and hexagon group. They know really where they sit in terms of their ability. And the art and design classroom or lesson is it's a genuine place where that doesn't have to exist. So again, I repeat that I'd be very wary about how we share those kinds of leveling assessment feedbacks with the students. So also important to think whether we are assessing the artwork or assessing learning. Now, you will have heard it said many times that art is subjective, and we've got an example here of two fairly similar artworks. The one on the left is by Picasso and the one on the right is by a young child. Now, in terms of assessing the artwork, if I asked you which one is better, that would be your subjective opinion. If we're assessing the learning, then again, we need to know what the learning was. Were we inviting the students to use line in their work? Were we inviting the students to mix and create their own colours? Were we inviting the students to look closely, to do close observational studies? Do we want the students to use different sized paintbrushes for the different areas? So again, really important to know whether we end up giving feedback or quantitative assessment that is assessing an artwork. Is not necessarily what we want to focus on. Another thing to keep in mind, and I talk about this in some of the other training that I have online, is that we might have different approaches to our art lessons. So, for example, one approach is that artists use their own ideas and experience to research, explore, and develop individual pieces of art. So, that might be an example where you said to the class, in a very student-led way, I want you to choose an issue or a news story that means something to you, and you're going to make a collage about it. You'll get outcomes that are open-ended, and they'll be very, very different for each child, which makes assessing from a skills and techniques perspective challenging. You might even, and again, I talk about this in my other training, you might have a scheme of work in year 6 where the students are choosing their materials. So they're deciding which of their ideas and experiences they're making work about, and then they're selecting the appropriate media. Therefore, your assessment for that isn't going to necessarily be about the medium that they've used. It might be more about how they've developed their ideas, how they've made their artwork in a way that it conveys the messages they want it to. Another style of art lesson might be that artists are learning a specific skill or technique, perhaps in their sketchbooks, and then that's put into a final piece. So the outcomes are specific. They might be more open-ended, but what this kind of style of art lesson does is it gives you that really clear mode of assessing, because you might be looking at how that student has mixed colours, how that student has used tone, how that student has created a 3D form. Again, teacher-led, or where artists are working to create a specific outcome. So, for example, you might have 30 versions of a flower still life inspired by Van Gogh's sunflowers, in which case assessing amongst your class is going to be, you're going to be able to look at those pieces of work relative to all the other pieces of work in that same class. You might also have elements to your art curriculum where students are writing about art or speaking about it and making links to other art. So these are some of the different ways that you might approach your art lessons, which will of course impact your modes of assessment. So, like I said earlier, the emphasis of assessment in a good art and design provision should be focused on learners receiving formative feedback. So I've got a video here, which I'm going to put a link to as part of your access to this training. And it's just a really nice video that shows an artist talking about the creative process, because the ideas I'm going to give you now are all linked to the fact that artists, when they work in real life, often have a really long, experimental, reflective process that lends itself to self and peer assessment that is genuinely useful. So at this juncture, I would say pause the training video and go and use the link and watch this video about the creative process, and then return back to continue with the slides. Art is made, and you'll have seen this if you looked at the video, art is made through a process of research, exploration, experimentation, reflection, reviewing, and refining. When artists work on a piece, it's very rare that they just make a final piece. What you'll see and maybe know is that a lot of artists start with an idea or something that's captured their attention. It might be something they've seen in nature, a song they've heard, a poem they've read. It might be something really kind of seemingly mundane, like when they're putting the rubbish out and the sound the bin lid makes. So artists are inspired by all sorts of things, things that we might not even pay attention to in our normal lives. Then they go through a process of exploring that theme or that idea. They might use different materials. They might be scrunching bits of paper to listen to the sound, or they might be laying down different types of fabric and putting paint on top. They might be drawing or collaging. Then, as they're doing that experimentation, they're often reflecting. They're looking at outcomes. They're thinking about what that feels like for them, what that looks like for them, whether it conveys the message they want to, or sometimes they're literally just following the process as it goes. So they're not going to the process with an idea of a final piece. They're very much letting the process and the experimentation drive what they are doing. Some people talk about this as being in the flow state, when you're being led by the act of what you're doing, and you've got that sensation of losing time. They review as they go, and that reviewing and refining as you go, when you're an artist or a creative working in creative endeavors, it becomes part and parcel. Think of somebody writing a song on the piano, how they're stopping and thinking and maybe scribbling notes down. It's the same when you're making visual art. You're reviewing and refining as you go, responding to what's happened, responding to the materials. So, assessment is really genuinely an integral part of making art. It actually mirrors the real life creative process. Artists are self assessing all the time as they are making work. This means that as art leaders, we can plan for assessment to be an intrinsic and actually a really important part of the lessons. It's all about how we train our students to see assessment and use it as part and parcel of the creative process. So, what's going to follow now are some practical suggestions of how you can integrate really genuinely useful forms of assessment into your classroom. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is something I call musical gallery walks. Now, you can see from the images here that we've got sketchbooks open with post-it notes on them. And of course, I train the students on how this is going to work first. So I explain to them that we're going to lay our artwork out and I'm going to play music. When the music stops, they need to stop at the piece of work they're in front of, and they're going to give feedback on the post-it notes. So when the music stops, you stop, you look, and you give feedback. Now, you as the teacher might want to establish what the students are looking for before you start the gallery walk, because otherwise you might be in danger of getting very generic feedback or just descriptive feedback, or kind of, wow, that's great, rather than specific. So for example, you might say, can we look at and talk about the other artists' use of tone or line? You might even want to do some examples with the students of how you might structure the feedback sentences before you send them off on the gallery walk. As the students walk around, really encourage them to look as they walk. So what we don't want is that mad kind of rush that you get in musical chairs. We want this to be a gallery walk. So the students are looking as they walk around in the same way as they would a gallery. Now, this can be done in the middle of a lesson. It can be done at the end of a scheme of work. It can be done at any juncture. The only thing that you need are the post-it notes on top. I really advocate not writing in sketchbooks. So post-it notes are really useful for that. And I mean teachers as well. I don't advocate that we mark sketchbooks in the way that we mark other textbooks, other exercise books. So this is a really useful, and the students absolutely love it. You can start this in year one. You can train year ones to do this. You might want to use, instead of writing on the post-its, you might start with kind of smiley faces, or you might start with just a very simple sentence or simple words, and you can build it up so that by the time they get to year 6, they're really used to stopping at various points in their lesson or scheme of work for musical gallery walks. And I always choose kind of calm music rather than party music, so that things don't get too kind of excitable. And always with any of these approaches that I'm going to talk to you about, I really advocate the discussion about the process with the students. So how was it for you to do that gallery walk? What did you find challenging about doing that? How do you think we can improve our musical gallery walks? Also, importantly, you must leave time for the artist to look at their feedback once they've returned to their books. I sometimes like doing it at the end of a lesson, so the students close their books, which means they can start the next lesson by reading the feedback. Art journey pages. So art journey pages look like mind maps, and what you have is a central theme. So for example, this was a year 6 page about war, and so they've got the title war. They were also learning about war in their history and topic lessons. So we started by them just mind mapping anything that came to mind when we said had the word war in the center, and it might be facts, but it could also be feelings. You might have discussions, and as you're talking, the students are writing things down. This is part of the project as well. So if you've got, for example, a 6-week scheme of work, you might have students revisiting that sketchbook page of the mind map or art journey page and adding to it as they go, as they get new ideas or new thoughts. So throughout the project, the artist can revisit the page and add ideas and facts. And at the end, they can also go back looking at their final piece and add branches that talk about their final piece and reflect and review their final piece in there. Or a second page with maybe a photograph of the final piece in the middle and this same kind of style of mind mapping. Mind mapping lends itself to that artistic way of thinking because it's non-linear, and often when we're developing our ideas in art, they come in a scattered, interconnected way rather than a linear way. And what you'll find is that some students really take to this really well because it's how they feel very naturally that their minds and ideas come and work. Artist get together. This is a really nice culture to build into your art lessons. So you gather the students around. Again, this can happen at the end of a lesson, in the middle of a lesson, at the end of a scheme of work. It should really be happening throughout. And you gather the students around with their artworks. It doesn't have to be final pieces. Remember, this can be sketchbook work. And you have a chat. You might want to establish a focus for the get together. So you could say, right, let's all get together, artists, and we're going to discuss what we should do next in this exploratory exercise. You might want to give each other some inspiration. So you might decide that artists can select a piece of work and they can talk about what they like and make a suggestion for that artist. You might want to discuss the techniques you're using. So it's sometimes really nice to stop, gather around and say, look, what's everyone finding difficult in this? And share tips and advice with each other. Artists can make notes when they return to their tables if they need to. You can take photographs of these get-togethers. In fact, any of these suggestions, you can take photographs of these assessments as they're happening, and those can be stuck into sketchbooks to show that these are modes of assessment that you are using. What's really nice about this one is you build that culture of trust amongst the artists in your classroom, where they're really comfortable giving each other advice and taking advice from each other, just like real artists do if they're working in a shared studio space. You're constantly being influenced by conversations and looking at each other's work. Pop-up exhibitions. So often in schools, what I see and hear is that art leaders are feeling sometimes under pressure to create these end of year shows or exhibitions that are quite formal and very well organised and everything's double mounted. Now, those are lovely and can be really nice events, but pop-up exhibitions are actually a really, really fun, useful, contemporary way for students to have a moment of reviewing and refining their work and looking at each other's work. This doesn't need to be done with huge preparation. In fact, it can be done spontaneously in lessons or planned for in the middle of lessons. You can use masking tape just to pop pieces of work up wherever in the classroom. And again, this is one of those things where if you start building the culture of it, your students will get really used to it and it will become part and parcel of your art and design culture. So you can see here, the girls in the photograph are looking at a piece of work that's been just pinned up in the school hall. And this might take half an hour. You can let them walk around and just look and talk. And again, it's that thing of discussing the process with the students. So talk about when you're in galleries, how often people do walk around, stop at a piece of art and have a quiet discussion with the person next to them about it. You might want to make it more structured. So you could have a list of questions or focal points for this, or you could just let them tour in pairs and have a chat as they go around. Again, you can take photos of this happening that can be stuck in sketchbooks to say this is one of the ways that we assess our work. These are all ways that the students, the artists, the children are being invited to think like real artists rather than assessment being applied to their work in a way that's not useful for them. You could even, with the pop-up exhibitions, invite other classes to come and view. So you could send an email around to year 5 that says on Wednesday afternoon, year 3 will have their work up in the hall, pop down if you fancy it, and that teacher can send students down in small groups to have a look. You know, obviously that has to be done in a school where you have a culture of being able to do things like that. But the emphasis is on pop-up exhibitions as opposed to, or as well as, these very well thought out, highly organized exhibitions, which take a lot of time and a lot of resources. So of course, so those are my suggestions for practical approaches to peer and self-assessment in your classroom. I really hope that you can take these on and use as many of them as much as possible so they become a very natural part of your art and design provision. Of course, the other way that we can assess is sketchbooks. And I said earlier that I don't advocate marking in sketchbooks, but sketchbooks are a really amazing way of you as a teacher and the students looking back on past work and seeing how and where progress has been made. So for example, this is a year 2 sketchbook. When this child is in year 4, if they've kept the same sketchbook, they will be able to look back at their progress in drawing or their progress in painting, whatever work they have in their sketchbooks. So sketchbooks are immensely useful for assessment. And again, sketchbooks, that's a whole nother training that we could go through, but sketchbooks should be a space for exploring, experimenting. So this child is experimenting with mixing different types of turquoise, having looked at the turquoise serpent mosaic from the Aztecs. Again, this is year 1, who were looking at still life, using the whiteboards of ways of drawing overlapping objects, setting up a composition, practicing colour mixing, which is what you can see here. They've been given samples of colours and they've been set the challenge of matching their colours, mixing and matching their colours as closely as possible to the swatches that they've got, and photographs of them actually doing that. And then they've got a little bit of annotation. So really good to start building in these things from a really young age. So the writing in the sketchbooks in year 1, you know, obviously it's going to have its limitations, but if we start building that culture of annotating, then it's going to move with them all the way up to year 6. And the post-it notes, like you saw, we use them in the gallery walks, but also useful for self-assessment. So sometimes you might want to ask children to just stop what they're doing and write themselves 3 targets for their own work on a post-it note in their book. And also post-it notes useful for you as the teacher if you want to comment on sketchbook work. Again, just an example of how annotation can be really good assessment, especially with Key Stage 2 children, that you can get them to reflect on processes. You can get them to do reflection at the end of a project. And in these sketchbook annotations, for example, this was a mask that 2 girls made together, pretty scary, but they were tasked with making a mask that would make them feel powerful and in charge, and this is what they came up with. Okay, so as part of their assessment, I encouraged them to write about what it was like to work collaboratively. So the pros and cons and things they found challenging about sharing a creative endeavour with another person, another artist. So again, like I've mentioned earlier, final pieces, you could get photographs stuck in and have reflection or assessment written around that. The skills I have used were, the design I made was, how it felt to work in collaboration with 3 other people. And then what I'm going to show you now is a video of a student doing what you might think of as a more formal type of written assessment. So this is the end of a scheme of work where we've been learning about this piece of work by Paul Klee, and the students created their own piece of artwork that was inspired by Paul Klee. And then at the end, because they'd had all this experience of looking at his work, talking about it, then making their own link to it, at the end they were asked to write a few words about the experience and their opinions on the artist's work.
Hang on, wait.
I like Paul Klee's painting Castle and Sun because he used his imagination and the artist used lines and shapes. His paintings come from his memory and I love the colours.
And then another example here. That was a year 2 child. This is a year 5 student.
Caravaggio has used chiaroscuro, which uses light and shadow to create drama. Contrast also creates drama. The disciples are shocked because they notice that Jesus has come alive again. Caravaggio has used great composition. The disciples and Jesus fill the page. Caravaggio has made us feel like we are part of the painting by leaving a space on the table, like we are going to put a chair there. The fruit bowl is falling off the table, looking like we are going to jump into the picture and catch it.
So those modes of assessment were generated through using worksheets similar to this as Key Stage 1 example, where you've got a bank of words to fill in the gaps, and then they're asked to complete the sentence, I like Monet's painting because, and this is a year 5 example where they're given some key terms that they have to explain, and then space for them just to respond and talk about the process of making work and the style of the artist, and also to talk about any facts or opinions about the artwork and the artist. So these are other options for assessment. Thinking about what I said earlier, that assessment doesn't have to just happen in relation to the skills and materials. You might also be assessing the student's ability to talk about work and to link their own work to that of another artist. Some schools do like to use these sorts of sheets. So end of term assessment, outcome. I'm pleased with my outcome this term because in my art this term I tried to, connecting a final piece to key concept. The artist I was learning about this term was, and my work is like this piece of art because. So these sorts of end of term assessments are fine, but they're certainly not the only form of assessment that I would do, and these will be even more effective if they're used in conjunction with the kinds of things that I talked to you about before, such as gallery walks and pop-up exhibitions, because unless the children and the students have been thinking about these things throughout, when it comes to the end and they're being asked to reflect, it's going to be a bit tricky for them. So again, you might want to have sort of questions like this, with lowest key stage 2 in this composition. What do you think the artist wants you to look at first? So all these sorts of quite advanced subject specific questions, which if you've been talking about these throughout the scheme of work, then the students are going to find this more accessible. So this is about building that culture of being able to talk and write about art as well as make art. So again, those examples that I just showed you are quite formal ways of assessing, and they're more useful if your school requires you to do them, or if that's what you feel you want to do, then those are going to be more effective if they're used alongside the formative assessment practical suggestions that I've given you. Also really important to keep in mind that there are many immeasurable outcomes of a good art provision or project. Now, things you will have maybe witnessed in the art classroom, things like that element of well-being and harmony that can happen when students fall into that kind of creative flow. The classroom often very naturally goes silent and the students are totally engrossed in that flow state in whatever they're making or doing. So well-being is often one of those immeasurable outcomes of a good art provision. Behaviour, often students find art as a kind of calming or therapeutic even subject. So these are immeasurable things that we might not be able to quantify, but we can witness and see. And one way that we might start to collate and think about those immeasurable benefits and outcomes is through pupil feedback. So talk to your students about what they like about art and design as a lesson, how they feel, ask them how they know when they've made progress. How do they know when they've made progress? You might get some interesting feedback. So here are some answers that I've had when I've asked students before, bearing in mind that I don't mark sketchbooks, I don't give formal or formative, summative assessment grades or levels. Students say things like, when I feel proud of my work and there are no more improvements to be made. So that is a student really trusting themselves to to take ownership over their own learning. I can look back through my sketchbook and I see how I have got better, like at drawing. One way is that I get feedback from my teacher and friends. I know because I feel less stressed. I just feel calm and good about my work. And if you think about it as adults, how do we know when we've made progress in something? We feel less stressed about it and we feel calm and good about it. Again, more feedback from students. There's no right or wrong in art, so I feel calm and relaxed in the art studio. It makes me feel free. I'm starting to feel more confident in art, and if I can achieve that in art, then I can feel like that in other subjects. I love how we are not judged in the art studio. There's no right or wrong. So pupil feedback, getting interviews in with students, asking them maybe to fill in some questions is a really nice way of sharing with other teachers and perhaps senior management and any visitors about how your art and design provision is doing so much more than just within the progress that you can measure within an art lesson. This is a nice quote from the director of the Murray Art Museum. The more we can create a society in which people seek their own answers, in which people address problems without allowing existing practices to restrict them, the sooner we can create a truly innovative society. A lot of what I've been speaking to you about today is about students taking ownership over their learning journeys. And we talk about that in other subject areas, but often it's not really happening. The art and design curriculum and art and design provision is a subject area where this can genuinely happen for a few of the reasons we've spoken about, because there are a lack of specifics about what has to be taught, because there are not government standards, because there's not really testing in art and design, and because when art and design is taught well, students genuinely take ownership over their learning journey. They build in self and peer assessment into the creative process, and therefore they learn to trust their own judgment calls.